Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, A Smarter and Secure Way to Work in Office 365 at Ofsted. Thanks for joining us. First off, let's start with some introductions. My name is John Peluso. I'm the CTO of AvePoint Public Sector and the Microsoft Regional Director. I focus mostly on modern collaboration, specifically within regulated industries, and trying to bridge that gap between fast, open, and agile sharing of information and ideas, with the same time trying to protect what needs to be protected and ensure that all that collaboration is happening in conjunction with information management and governance policies. And I'm joined today, and I'm very happy to welcome Darren, one of our customers. So Darren, do you want to introduce yourself and your company?
Yeah, certainly. So I work for Ofsted. I've worked in the IT industry for about 25 years, mix of public and private sector, although the majority of it has been at Ofsted for 18 years. So I've been setting up service support solutions and been involved with various digital transformation programs. And over the last 5 years, I've been very involved with the move away from traditional on-premise solutions to the Office 365 stack, and trying to make sure that we deliver what the customer needs, basically.
Awesome. So we'll be the two talking heads to everyone out there in the audience today. Some housekeeping issues before we move into our content. Obviously, this webinar is being recorded, so get as much value as you can. And if you think that there will be others in your organization or your sphere that can benefit from it, watch out for the link to the recording afterwards. Also, there's a chat feature in this platform that we're using that allows you to enter questions. And if you do so, we'll see them. We do have some dedicated Q&A time at the end of the session, but also very happy to see your questions as we move along. So feel free to type them in whenever you have a question. The speakers here can see the question. So if a question is timely, we may address it right in stream. If not, we may park it and answer it at the end of this session. So welcome, and I'm gonna hand it off, Darren, to you to talk a little bit about your journey over there at Ofsted.
No problem. Cheers, thank you. All right, so just to give you a bit of an idea of who Ofsted are, most people, if you're a parent or know friends who are teachers, then you'll know who Ofsted are. So we're seen as we inspect schools, and we also regulate all services related to children and young people. So if you can, John, if you just press the button and open up a couple of these bits. So we inspect, which is the main thing that most people recognise us for. So there's over 30,000 schools that we need to inspect, and over 80,000 earlier providers as well, which offer 2.8 million registered childcare places. So there's a lot there to inspect. But one thing that a lot of people don't realise, we also inspect, we also recognise unregistered schools and look to try and close those down because they're classed as illegal schools. So, for example, over the last 2 years, we've closed down 420 of those. In amongst that, we also regulate early years provision as well. So if you want to be a childminder or set up a nursery or anything like that, that has to be go through Ofsted to be regulated, and you've got to go through a process to register with us. We do some various checks. And finally, one of the other things that we do is that we also inform policy through DFE and obviously government policy for education. So we do a little bit more than just school inspections, basically. Sorry, John,
yeah, so it sounds like a combination of really important, really critical official work, but also a tremendous burden. So you guys must have to move pretty quickly while at the same time trying to stay very in line with policy.
We do, yes, yeah, and in fact we also drive some of that policy and make sure that everybody is regulated in the right way. There's quite a lot of data there related to safeguarding as well, even though a lot of the data that we do we actually do publish on our website. There's a lot of information that we need to keep hold. So we're quite a disparate organisation with regard to where we work. So there's 2,000 direct Ofsted employees across 8 different regions. We've got round about up to 800 inspectors, and we've got 1,200 back office staff. Now they're directly employed by Ofsted, but we also in the last few years have started employing what we call Ofsted inspectors. Now, Ofsted inspectors are actually people who are potentially headmasters or working in the education sector, who will do 1 or 2 inspections a term. And that was kind of trying to demystify what Ofsted do, because sometimes we had a bit of a bad reputation within education. People saw us as being a bit evil, as it were, that we were coming into schools and trying to see what the good and bad was. So we had a bit of a bad reputation. So the Ofsted inspection program was a way of trying to demystify what we were trying to do and deliver. But that obviously brought us a bit of a fresh challenge. So on top of this, what you see there on that slide, we've got anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 individuals who use some of our systems to do those inspections. And one of the big things that we've had, a challenge that we've always had, which does make the place very interesting to work at, is the fact that pretty much half of the organisation are remote workers, and we've had that challenge since I started back in 2001. So that definitely does provide a bit of a challenge on sharing data and things like that.
Yeah, and that's something that we see, this idea of a quote modern world of work, right? Initially, people thought of that as, oh, these newer startup companies that are working in this way. But I think I'm seeing that even within government and classic organizations, the amount of teaming and working across geographical boundaries and time zones is something that we see all the time. So high time for this modernization effort, probably. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. So we set a bit of a challenge over the last few years. So if you just click on the next one there. So the idea is sharing. We want to do more sharing. There's a lot of emphasis on that, and I think the technology that a lot of people use nowadays enables that sharing a lot to be a lot easier. And within an organization and enterprise, sharing is not always that easy to do, because you would need to be secure as well. So you've got that dual challenge of sharing more information but keeping it more secure, particularly at the moment with a lot more threats and things like that. Now, we had the challenge of doing that but also having less money, and on the next button there, John, less resource. So we had that challenge of, well, how are we going to do this? And that expectation of people, certainly in the last less than 10 years or so, the idea of a smartphone is just as powerful as any laptop, that you should be able to work as freely as you can. Is something that just is almost an expectation. People have that kind of technology at home, and they want to have that accessible within their workplace as well, which is a very different proposition to what we would have had 10 years ago.
Sure, absolutely. And obviously this is a journey that many organizations are on, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the old style of what you were doing and walk us through? And I think this slide is perfect for it.
Yeah, so if we just click the first button there. So back in 2013, when we started this, we were that traditional old style. So people were provided a laptop and a BlackBerry. Some lucky people in 2013 also had an iPhone, but not many people.
Oh boy.
All of our infrastructure was on premise. It was physical servers. And it was in one location. We didn't have multiple data centers or anything like that, and we hosted pretty much all of the applications. They were all in our data center, and we had, as you can see there, we had 2 different inspection applications for early years and for schools and further education, and we didn't have anything really externally hosted. Software as a service just didn't really exist. So we started on kind of a transition element, and this, as you can see there, we started to branch out into iPhones and iPads. A lot more people had those. Blackberries were slowly being phased out, and we started moving away from our single data center into a virtual data center, but we kept some things on site as well. So, and we had a very old style DR solution that was till 5 or 6 days to bring everything back up, things like that. So it was very traditional because we were still in that kind of bridging the gap there. As you can see, we still had a lot of hosted applications as well, so all on premise still, and we started to try and move away from separate inspection tools to one, but that was a phased approach, which we were just in that transition period at that time. But you can start seeing those first software as a service solutions starting to come through. So we started something called Ofsted Online. So I mentioned earlier regulatory services. So if you want to apply to be a nanny or a childminder, you went through the Ofsted Online solution, which was the first big service that we had that was hosted off-site, basically, so as a software as a service. And we started to dabble into this, seeing this requirement to share data securely with external departments and local authorities and things like that. So we started to look at Huddle and Google Drive. This was off the back of, at the time, within UK government, Francis Maude was not a big fan of Microsoft, and we were getting a very clear steer to try and move away from the Microsoft stack, really. A few of us within Ofsted were cynical about that, because we'd always been a Microsoft house, and it just felt that wasn't quite right. But we tried it, and we went down that road for a year or so, and then we moved into the next area, the virtual IT. So we kind of moved, we had a big program we call the Future IT program, where we'd previously been under one big prime supplier, and they provided all the solutions, networks, DR, everything, the whole lot. And we kind of started to split that up to smaller companies, and we started to look at, well, where can we start getting some better services and have everything that the benefits of cloud. So from the DR perspective and things like that. So one of the things I should have mentioned, something that we hosted previously for our contact center, was a solution called Aspect. And we had in our data center, it was quite complicated to upgrade, and in 2017 we moved to a company called Puzzle, who provided a cloud-based contact center solution, and it changed things. And we were also had the opportunity to go for the Office 365. Pressure wasn't on, I think people realized that the Office 365 suite was good, and because we are an educational department, we also got the educational discount. So just from pricing perspective, it just made sense to go with Office 365. And I'll go into a little bit more detail of how we did that in the next slide. So if you go on to the next one to tell that I haven't updated this since last October when I did this, but you can see there now fewer and fewer apps have been hosted by in the Ofsted data center. Only things that have been hosted are our finance solution and our HR system and our inspection solution. Everything else has been moved away into software as a service. So it's changed completely from where we were in those 5 years. So we've moved quite quickly, I think, within government. Everything's across Office 365 has changed the way that we work, and I'll talk through that on the next slide.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I think this is a great example of an entire IT landscape changing over time, and frankly in a short period of time. And I think now we're going to change gears a little bit, and let's zoom all the way into how people are collaborating, right? Which is obviously a part of that larger landscape. So talk to me about the evolution of this kind of teamwork that you guys had internally.
Yeah, so if you just click on to the next bit. So this is how they were working back in 2013, really. So everything was locked down to the BlackBerry or the laptop, and you could only work on that device. We had this seems very archaic when you look at it now. My docs we had that would allow you to sync your documents up. So if your laptop died, then if you've got a new one, your 250 megs worth of documents would be synced back up. Mailbox.
That's only about 3 songs. I mean, I know. How am I going to get the rest of my songs in there?
It is crazy. It's mad to think that was how we worked. I mean, some people obviously had a 1 gig limit, but they had to put in a request for that to happen. Somebody within the ops would have to increase that and stuff like that. And we had a SharePoint 2007 on-prem solution that was introduced in 2009, but that was purely locked down into internal collaboration only. And we and we'll touch on this in a little while. It was we locked it down too much with the check-in process and things like that, so it was very difficult even internally to work with that. So the kind of the modern workplace, as it was this kind of using Office 365 and Skype for Business to try and make the change on how people work. So staff can, although this is slightly different, we are starting to restrict some things that people can do, not on an Ofsted device, while we look at some security stuff. But now everybody has their OneDrive, which is a 40 gig limit. Obviously everybody can get 1 terabyte, but we want to restrict that, just or else you have lots of information, and it's quite scary that some people have already hit the 40 gig limit. In less than a couple of years. Likewise, mailbox limit as well was increased, and we had the option to be able to collaborate with anyone. So it changed things quite radically. So if you just click on the next, so it enabled us to start sharing information with Ofsted inspectors and with other providers and local authorities as well. We could start to share information, and we were in a position where at one stage we were paying for Huddle and for Google Drive to be able to share with these external providers and local authorities. We've now, over the last few years, we've stopped that. So there's no Huddle accounts, no Google Drive accounts, and that has saved us a significant amount of money. And it just frees everybody up.
Yeah. So and again, this is I think this is a perfect example of by taking advantage of the technology that you have at your disposal, the real impact on business process. I mean, if you look at the kind of closed loop on the left and the open loop on the right, one of the things that I see in organizations, especially regulated organizations, where sharing is, not necessarily first seen as a good thing, or at least is always tempered by a but what if? And you mentioned it too, right? So collaborate with anyone doesn't mean everything is open, right? It means correct, where appropriate. Right? We can have collaboration that uses the same technology, the same processes as we have for our internal collaboration. And one of the examples here that I see customers starting to take advantage of is the idea of device access policies, right? So certain sites, certain locations should be accessible from the outside, certain ones shouldn't. And by the outside, I mean by outside devices, right? I don't care if someone gets here on their personal smartphone, but over here, no way, right? So it doesn't have to be a big global on or off switch.
Absolutely. I mean, we have done that with conditional access. So outside the UK, you can't access our Office 365 suite and things like that. So so it allows us to have that control that we didn't necessarily have previously.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so what's next?
So this is the roadmap that we went down. So 2016 was where we really started to use Office 365, and we use it as a bit of a scenario, really. We were swapping out a lot of devices, and I touched on the fact that people had a very limited synced My Documents option. We did also allow people to have a D drive that was a maximum of 2 gig. Now, every time we swapped out laptops, it was a real pain, because we then have to either give them explicit instructions on how to take that data off and sync it back up, or we even needed to get engineers to do it. So it was quite costly to us, time consuming as well. So we actually use OneDrive. Not many organizations maybe started here, but we started with OneDrive first, and that enabled us to cut down cost and reduce times on getting the devices swapped out, which was good. It means now, still to this day, if we need to swap out a device, everything's on there. It's just synchronized and they just hand it over. So that's really useful.
And that technology has matured significantly, right? I mean, I'm looking internally now at things like folder redirection using OneDrive. So it's almost effortless, right? Your downloads, your documents and everything just automatically syncing back and available on your new device.
Yes, there's loads of, we still, some people are really au fait with it, but we're still, educating people on getting the best out of OneDrive. Skype, we also had in, although we've actually been using, we originally started with OCS back in 2009, so we'd always been using that, but we upgraded to Skype in 2016. And then we started probably the chunk of the migration, which in 2017 was Exchange and Outlook. That was took us 3 or 4 months to do that piece of work, and we did that all internally, and we very quickly got the benefit of that. I think it was April or May of that year. We had, if anybody is based in London, there was an underground fire in Holborn on Kingsway, and that was where our head office was at the time. And basically, we couldn't get into the building for about a week. The power kept going up and down. We had to shut down our comms room in there. And if we'd had our old solution set up, we'd have lost email, and anybody who had worked in the London office wouldn't have been able to access their work for about a week, because their laptops were generally in the office. So very quickly, senior management saw the benefits, and it was very timely that, and they suddenly started to get the real life example of why cloud computing could actually work for them, really. So that was good timing for us. That year we also did we moved to SharePoint for our SharePoint Online for our intranet, which again saved us quite a bit of money, and we introduced Delve, the Office 365 online suite, and we started to use Intune to manage all of our mobile phones at that stage as well.
Yeah.
And then 2018, we decided to do the complicated job, which was moving off our on-premise SharePoint solution to move across onto SharePoint Online, which took a little while, and that was where we started to really think about what we wanted longer term in the SharePoint space. And we also started to introduce forms, Power Apps, Flow, and Power BI to the business, and we started to see quite interesting use cases for those solutions for business problems that we couldn't quite solve with any other tool. So it's been quite beneficial. But yeah, SharePoint was
And did you find that the Flow and Power Apps stuff helped you replace some of the legacy custom development that you may have had on SharePoint, or was it mostly net new capability?
It's a bit of a mixed, really. So I think it's helped us. So we had a lot of info path forms, which obviously Microsoft no longer support, or certainly on the withering on the vine, as it were. So we had the problem of migrating stuff that was in old SharePoint into new, and there was just no way we could do that with InfoPath. So we ended up doing brand new processes with those. Not necessarily the easiest thing to do, but we've got there, and I think we've pretty much done all of them now. And we also used Power Apps and SharePoint for what we call EEG, which is electronic evidence gathering, which is a big new piece of service that we're introducing to all inspectors to enable them to do electronic evidence gathering on site, whereas previously they were just making notes and then comparing notes at the end of the day, and then having to gather all that paper written stuff. So that's saving us time. So yeah, some good use cases. This year we're looking at Teams, multi-factor authentication using the Authenticator app, and the question mark, because there is lots of other things that we could use these things for, and you never know what Microsoft are going to launch next as well. So there's always some new stuff that comes out. So so that's been our journey.
Oh yeah, and rapid, right? I mean, think about the pace of IT progress pre 2013, 14. It's the journey you've been on in such a short time is really a testament to the ability to get this all planned and executed. So pretty impressive.
So SharePoint to SharePoint. So this is the if you just click on again, just to the next step. So we so SharePoint, when we brought it in 2009 using SharePoint 2007, we did a lot of customization as people do. It didn't quite deliver what we wanted at the time, so there was some third-party tools used, but we were also trying to use it as a full-on records management solution. So we did try to bring in metadata, and tried and forced a check-in process. So if you put something into SharePoint, you had to check it in, and if you wanted to edit it, you had to check it out, which sounds great. And I think certain areas that is absolutely what you should do, depending on what you're working on. Problem is, we did it for all sites, and people just didn't like it. The vast majority of the calls that our SharePoint team had to resolve were related to files being locked out and the original owner either having left or not being available to check it back in and things like that.
Right.
So one of the things, we did a bit of user research on, what people wanted in SharePoint Online, and somebody came up with, I can't take the credit for this, put the share back into SharePoint. And that was kind of our that was our kind of goal, really. We've moved away from the collaboration in quotation marks in the old SharePoint into the new, basically. So that was our main goal.
I saw this actually almost the exact scenario in a very large global financial organization, another customer of ours, who was planning. We sort of came into contact with them when they were in a similar place in this move from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online, and they had put a lot of effort into really locking down SharePoint on-prem, as you can imagine in that industry. But it was a mantra, and it was really interesting to sit in their workshops and things like that and hear them talk internally about, hey, let's not make the same mistakes we made before. And there is a way to do this securely without going too far onto one side. And I think this next slide is actually a perfect time to really talk about that, right? So it's about balance,
Yes, and it is. You kind of want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. So you want the right information to be secure. You want to be able to know who's doing what. You need to understand who has control, who is the main the information asset owner, all that kind of thing. You need to capture all that side of things. You've got to make it easy to collaborate in a secure way, and allow full usage of the tools. And I mean, it was quite strange, the view. We'd used Huddle for a couple of years, and that was quite expensive for us. And people were saying, well, you can't use SharePoint, you've got to use Huddle. And I was like, well, no, fundamentally, they're very similar systems. It's just putting the right governance around them, and that can save you all this money. But it's doing it in the right way, and don't just allow everybody to externally share, but control what sites can have external sharing switched on and things like that, and have that approval process. And that was one of the things that we wanted to do, is make it easy to use, but in the right way and as safe as we could, to make sure that people didn't accidentally share externally things that they shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think one of the places that people get locked up in this sometimes is, and you know full well, right? There's policy aspects to this. There's process aspects, and there's technology, right? So let's take something simple. And there's a question, I think, in the chat right now about tagging of documents and using metadata or classification on documents. And very common strategy, information management strategy. SharePoint for a long time, right, has had the ability to make optional or require metadata on documents. But number one, what's the policy, right? How do you want to handle that? Number two is the process, right? So if we're an organization that has, let's say, wants to classify the sensitivity or the other attributes of the documents, how do we get those terms pushed out so that we're not relying on the site owners all the time to put the right metadata in libraries? And then there's a technology piece of that, right, which is simply the application of that metadata. If you look today in the modern listen libraries in SharePoint, it is significantly more intuitive, right, for users to interact with metadata than it was before. So what's the story within Ofsted as far as classification and metadata? Is that something that you guys leverage in the SharePoint tool?
Not as much as we could. It's difficult. The first point you make, it's have you got a proper policy and that you want to administer into things? And if you do, and you understand that, then the technology can help you to get that metadata in there. And we tried to do that initially at the very beginning, but it was quite quick that we couldn't quite get the agreement on what everybody wanted to do and the approval process to do that. So we've gone quite a light touch with it. the main area where we've seen a bit of a benefit anyway is that the search capability within SharePoint Online is so much better than what we had in SharePoint 2010 anyway. So it just is, and the things that get in delve and things just make searching for stuff a lot better than it was previously. I think we've still got the goal that we'd like to do that. So we have done a few templated documents that you can obviously put in. So one of the things we did is, maybe just jump on it ahead a little bit, but with the self-service tool that we've got certain templates that we can create. So when somebody asks for an external sharing site, every external sharing site looks the same. And we've done something similar with projects. And the idea there was that we could start to drop in like the organizational PID or risk register or whatever. And then what you can do is you can add that into the template of that site. So every time a project site is created, you've got those templates and you've got the metadata against those templates, basically.
Yeah.
So, and that's something that we haven't leveraged yet fully. We have a little bit, but not as much as we could. But I think it just seems so big a task. I think whenever you ask our information management team, there's a lot to do, and I think we probably need to start small, really.
Yeah, simple, small wins, I think sometimes, right?
Definitely.
So this slide just speaks to what you were saying a little bit, and so I just advanced it. And obviously, what we're talking about here is striking that right balance of what do I need to control, but not go so far that the system becomes unusable. And there's a story, it's a pretty common story that we hear, but highly regulated public sector organization has a crazy system, which is, going to store their most secure documents, but it requires 26 character passwords with special, with special symbols, and needs to be changed once a month. And the reality of the situation is this organization ended up in a pretty bad spot because the system was so difficult to use that people would regularly put their documents, either email them to themselves or put them on drives and take them home to work in the attempt to do the right thing, right? In the attempt to get work done and be productive, because it was so often that they couldn't get into the system that had been created. So it is possible to really go too far on the right-hand side here and lose the fact that you are actually less secure because people aren't using you. This is the common sort of shadow IT, phenomenon. But talk a little bit about the goals and how you guys came at this, right? Because you didn't have any kind, what we see in some organizations is a lot of custom development around governance tooling and provisioning processes. Where were you guys as far as all this goes, and what was the thought process about where you wanted to go?
So I suppose the first, the main aim of the original SharePoint migration project was purely that. It was about migrating the data out into SharePoint Online, and we didn't really factor in on the governance side initially. So we didn't go out to procure a tool to do that as such. We knew we had a problem there. Originally, it was very restrictive. SharePoint site creations initially, but we found, it was just taking too much time of operations and stuff like that to keep creating sites. So it was site owners were allowed to create their own sites in the old version, but it just became a bit of a sprawl. People were doing sites in very different ways at different levels within the structure as well, and it was just becoming unmanageable, really. So we wanted to try and make sure that we could have some kind of self-service that could repeat that process, but give us a little bit of the governance, and make sure that, as I mentioned earlier on, we had some certain set templates that we wanted. So we wanted like a team site, and we wanted an internal collaboration site, and we also wanted external as well as projects. And we wanted to make sure that if you wanted an external site, it was the same process every single time. So we were looking for that. We wanted to make it easy for people as well, so it wasn't just the site owner that was having to capture that. But we also had certain information, the information about the buyer and the IAM around. We wanted to make sure that we were capturing that, and that that was somewhere on the actual site itself. So if you knew, because quite often if you asked somebody who the site owner is, they didn't know at all. They generally didn't know who to go to if there was a problem. And one of the big things we did was we did a basically interviewed as many of the site owners as possible. So we had a full list. We had over 1,000 sites, and quite quickly, 10%, well, over 10% of those were what we called orphans, where they could never track down who the site owner was, or that the site owner had left, and things like that. So we actually deleted over 50% of all those sites as part of the migration. And again, we kind of realised, well, we don't want to keep doing that. You know, it won't take long before it gets quickly out of control. So we wanted to try and keep it as simple as possible without it being a big overhead on information management or the operations team to do that, basically.
Sure.
So we wanted to make sure that we did have some kind of policy that we could apply, that if something isn't being, or somebody does leave, then we can capture that, or they can request who the new site owner is and make it as easy as possible, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these are exactly the things, right? And with varying level of maturity. You know, we've talked about this in the past, Aaron, is that, you know, the good news is that the approaches, while they may differ in implementation, a lot of the concepts are exactly the same, right? We have to have some kind of repeatable, consistent process. This way, operations knows what to expect, users learn what to expect and what the process is, and we're not relying on people making decisions at every step of the way, which is really where the wheels can come off the bus. I also appreciate what you said about this cataloging of what you have. We hear it referred to, actually we had one very large retail manufacturing organization, about 260,000 users. When we encountered them, they had about 50,000 existing SharePoint site collections, and they hadn't formally launched Office 365 groups yet, but they already had 6,000 of those.
Wow.
And for them, this was the key, right? Being able to say, I know what this asset is, I know who it belongs to, I know who it maps back to, I know the last time someone vetted it and put their, you know, their agreement that they would be willing to own it. So being able to have that kind of cataloging and awareness of your, ready for this one? Here's a 50-cent phrase: the collaboration asset inventory.
Wow.
This is a big goal that we see, especially with the ease which with people can spin up resources and so forth, especially in Office 365. So I think maybe what we'll do now, because the journey, the Ofsted journey didn't stop here, right? So this is kind of where we got engaged, and you know, from the AvePoint side, one of the things that we want to do is understand what's the goal and how do we get there, right? So this is a common thing that we go through in early stage governance workshops with our customers to help them understand that it is about that balance, right? So when you go to, let's say, a store or a supermarket or something, and how do you know where to park? Well, of course, there's lines on the ground. So the parking lot administrator, if we can use that phrase, has figured out the most efficient and effective use of that parking lot, right? There's a benefit for the parking lot admin in that it's the way to get the most cars safely in there. So I maximize the effectiveness and the potential return, right, of people shopping in my store. There's also a tacit agreement with the shoppers, right? If you park in the lines, things will be safe, right? I will offer you some guidance. So the short answer here is that governance on one level is in part about guidance much of the time. If we just help people understand the right thing to do, for the most part, people will do it, right? Especially if it works for them. However, right, there are times when we need controls, right? So whether that be because it's going to hurt you, the parking lot user, or me, the parking lot admin, there are times I do need to put some hard barriers in there, and understanding what those options are is really the way to strike the right balance. And similar, Darren, to what you were saying, I spent probably the better part of the last 4 or 5 years going around and talking to regulated customers in different industries, public and private sector. And when we were in the early stages of development and design on the Office 365 and SharePoint governance solution that we built, we didn't actually start from a technology perspective. We said, let's go talk to these regulated industries and let's find out some of the core concepts and how they're just thinking about governance. And the first thing was that to the point of this repeatable and consistent service delivery, most of them had a service catalog concept, right? So they had sort of put some effort into defining what does the business need, what do various areas of the business needs, and let's think about those as services, right? So it wasn't SharePoint as a platform that you did anything that you wanted with. It was a particular site that was configured a particular way with particular features enabled, and perhaps was only available to a very particular part of the audience, but it was very business driven. And users actually like that because they get what's appropriate for them and they don't have to just figure it out every time or get a very bare bones thing. So this idea of a service catalog was something that we took away and said, that would be really cool to do for collaboration in things like SharePoint and Office 365. And another thing here, which is about balance, right, is that there are some high risk requests and some low risk requests. And so perfect example in the modern Office 365 world is I want a team that can collaborate internally and externally versus maybe I just want a team that can collaborate internally. Well, the latter is a low risk behavior. And maybe I don't want to slow the user down. So I allow them to request that and I give it to them immediately, as opposed to the request for a team that is externally enabled or guest access enabled, which has to go through whatever the appropriate approval ring is, right? And so this idea of being able to understand the request and the business need behind the request helps you balance out what needs higher or lower levels of control. We talked about this one quite a bit, but almost all organizations that we were talking to had this idea of being able to know what you have at any point in time, especially in a system like SharePoint, where it's kind of tough, right? It grows, and with Office 365, right, with users being able to create groups and teams and plans and all kinds of stuff, this is even more important, right? So this idea that at any point in time I might need to answer for the collaboration workspaces I have was key. Now, one of the other things that we saw here, and this harkens back to the metadata question we had before, we see a strategy, especially in larger organizations, where they say, look, I can't chase every single document, right? So being able to sort of track ownership, track purpose, track sensitivity at every document is almost too difficult in a large organization. So what they start thinking about is, how do I approach this at the container level, right? Whether it be a site, a team, a group. If I know what that site, group, or team is intended to serve from a collaboration perspective, I know roughly how to treat it, right? And now I'm not treating individual documents, I'm handling it at a higher level. So this is another strategy we saw. Recertification. This is a pretty common concept across multiple industries, where on a schedule, organizations wanted to have some kind of ability to track that, number one, whatever this collaboration asset was, it was still required. The owner still accepted responsibility in some formal way, and that they reviewed the current access permissions, right, to that workspace, and any appropriate metadata for that workspace to make sure it was still current, because everything that we just talked about back here in the ongoing management and cataloging is only as good as the data that you have, right? So this recertification is not only a way to keep security happy, but also as a way to say, hey, look, my landscape report here is also very current and accurate. And then the last thing that I see in a lot of regulated organizations is process around end of life. So just like we may want to have a managed provisioning process, we probably want to have a managed deprovisioning process. Very common, I've gotten this one a lot, where, hey, anytime someone wants to delete, a site or a team or a group, legal needs to have 60 days to review. Okay, fine, well, let's have a managed deprovisioning process where a delete of a workspace can be initiated, and then it sits in a legal queue for 60 days while they review it and decide what to do, or if any of that content needs to be protected in some way. So these are the kind of concepts that we saw, and what we did is we tried to embody them into the software. So basically, the way we tried to approach this, and the solution that that we worked with Ofsted on, was in our cloud governance solution. right, which has functionality in these three main areas around provisioning, management, and lifecycle. And so what I'll do is I'll step quickly through some of the features that are there, and we'll tie it all up by talking about what and how Ofsted has used thus far, what the plan is next, and kind of what you've seen in terms of the effect on the organization having brought a tool set like this into play. So the first thing here is, Darren, you mentioned the provisioning. This is a challenge most folks face, right? They want to be accommodating, they want business to be agile, but at the same time, we need things done properly. And we know that Microsoft has a preference for self-service in the Office 365 suite, where users, just simply click on, I want a new group, I want a new team, and pretty much get it. But these are some of the concerns around that, right? Sprawl and duplication, and is it appropriate? Is this even the right thing to do? So one of the things that we've done in the software is essentially allow a user to very quickly enter into what we call as a questionnaire. And I'll show you actually a live version of this. Let's go into here. So here's just a simple Office 365 interface, and what we've done is we've embedded the self-service portal, right? So this is the AvePoint. This is the AvePoint solution. Familiar look and feel, right, for users to get around in. But you can see here, I'm not answering questions about, do you want a team, do you want a site, do you want a group? I'm answering questions about my business purpose, right? So do you have more or less than 5,000 users? Do you already have a workspace for this collaboration? No. Right? How would you prefer to work, chat-based or email-based? Do you need to collaborate internally, externally? These are all very business-centric questions, obviously. And let's go back to the parking lot example, right? Just guidance. Now, why am I asking these questions? Well, in the back end, we know that the current upper limit for users in a team is 5,000. I'm not going to rely on my user to know that, but I'm going to ask them a question. Also, do they need a group? Do they need a team? Do they need a site, right? Well, how do you want to collaborate? Chat or email? I don't need the users to know whether a group or a team or a site is best for them. I'm going to ask them based on their business purpose. And so what we see is that with a simple user experience behind this, we can hide quite a bit of complexity. This is the back-end configuration in the admin side of the tool, where we can do this kind of branching off of what you need. So from a service catalog perspective, this allows you to be very, very business-centric and almost interview the user, while at the same time ensuring that whatever options you want to make available are available, and whatever you want to lock down is available. This is another screen of the back-end admin interface, where you can decide what is available for request. You'll see some concepts here, such as the ability to say whether a user can request something or whether it's mandated by the service designer, right? So this is an example here. Do I want to ask the user if guests are allowed, or do I want to mandate that in certain services guests are allowed versus not? Right. Another example here of mandating naming conventions during the provisioning process. Again, this is on the IT admin side where you would do this, but you can see we can factor many different attributes in. So if we go back to that request process, right, what I'm ultimately going to get here, if I say I want chat and I want outside access, what I'm going to land in is a service request that is appropriate for an external team. Again, I don't know that as a business user. That just happens to be what I'm going to get. And you can see that there are some options that are grayed out, right? Again, it's some controls here. I don't want this to be able to be a public group. This will probably need to go through some approval. You can see us tracking back to department for cataloging purposes. We have ownership, right? So primary and secondary ownership. This is probably the first time I've demoed this in the UK. So Ian Anderson and Barrymore Barlow are probably much more well known from those Jethro Tull fans. But you can see here that I can allow them to speak to memberships, and I can apply policies to the team or group, and even require metadata, right? So what line of service is this mapping back to? What region is this mapping back to? And you can see here where the naming convention is even enforced, so that every team that gets created through this external request process is going to be tagged with public, external, and then whatever name I have. So you can see the amount of control that you have actually during the request process. And this can be as agile as you want, right? We can say that users that go through the process can have it, or they have to go through an approval process. So it is a very conditional thing. In this case, you can see we've got a configuration in the backend that says if they ask for a private group, they can have it without approval. And if they want a public group, that's going to require approval. So we can do that kind of routing as appropriate through the organization. Here you see also the policy settings that I was mentioning before. So pretty cool in terms of managing that provisioning. The next step is what about ongoing management and operations of this group, team, or site? And the reason we keep saying group, team, or site is because it doesn't matter, right? These concepts are applicable no matter what. And so how are we going to do things like monitor our landscape? Well, this is your landscape report, right? So this is an example of taking a look at all of your collaboration workspaces that are out there, all the various attributes of them, whether they are built-in things like the URL and the name of the site, group, or team, but also things here you can see like the custom metadata, what division, what group, what purpose. These reports are all exportable. I have organizations that are using these for chargeback models and things like this, right? As well as for compliance and audit purposes. I can even use this report to go ahead and communicate with the business owners or apply new policies and so forth and so on. So lots of significant value there. Again, all of that information is only as useful as it is current and accurate. So this is an example of a recertification process, and I'll show you that from the business user's perspective. Let me get out of this request, and I'm going to come back over here to my home screen. And you can see things being pushed out to my users. This is the home page of the governance, the AvePoint governance solution. And here we go. I've got admins that are pushing out communications to me. I can see things that are up to me for approval, right? In this case, I've got a group that is pending renewal. So let's actually take a look at what that is. And so here's the workspace. I'm being asked to renew it. And you can see here messaging down to the user about what the process is and if they're willing to accept responsibility. Are the contexts still correct? Yes, in this case. We know that this happens to be a group or a team renewal request. So we know that SharePoint permissions can be different than the membership of the group or team. So here's where I get to review the permissions of all of the groups, what access they have, who's in the group, and so forth and so on. Moving on from there, I can even, and I have my screen exploded out here, so just give me a half a second here. All right, so on from here, what I can do is review the memberships, do some promoting and demoting and adding and changing memberships, and then finally move on to confirming metadata and then submitting this. And this now goes back into the queue, and there's auditing of the fact that this process was completed. So again, this kind of end-to-end strategy here where there's oversight, there's monitoring at all steps of the process. And then finally, the end of life process is here. So having a managed deprovisioning process. So complex admin screen here, but you can see that what we've got is we're allowing groups or teams to live for a year. Then we are requiring, in this case, that the owners need to review that and decide what to do. Does the group or team move to additional lifecycle deprovisioning processes if the owner does not respond to the task, right? I think I had a task here, so let's take a look at what the owner sees, right? Barry's got this task for site collection lifecycle management. and it looks like someone has requested, a site owner has requested to extend the lease of their site. And so now I can say that's okay, right? And the request to extend that site has also gone through the system. So you can see all these kinds of processes, and by fully automating them, what you're able to do is actually bring forward a lot of those concepts, Darren, that were in your sort of thinking about how to do this, but not have to chase down every one of them. So I know you guys
Yes, yeah.
are still early in your journey on this solution, but talk a little bit about what you've seen thus far in terms of how you've been able to leverage some of this capability.
Yeah, so I think if you just click through the top three, and I'll
Yeah, sure.
talk through them. So the big thing for us was time. We previously allowed site owners to create their own sites, which had caused problems. You got a whole mix of certain things. We didn't really know what was going on. Information management didn't know what was going on. So, but we still wanted to have that control, but we wanted to make sure it was a swift change around. So we saw the capability within the cloud governance tool to allow information management to gather all the information that they needed to be able to track who was the business owner for all of that information, so they could go and track those people down if needs be, but allowing the site owner to very quickly create a site. Essentially, we did all of the site provisioning except for external had a single approval status, so it didn't just automatically create the site, but what would happen is it would go to the either the buyer or the information asset owner to say, is this okay to create this? Because we wanted the owner of the data to be knowing that a site had been created, which that was not the way that it had worked previously. So so you had that straight off, that bit of control. Information management, we're getting the information of what those sites were and who the buyer and the IM were as well. So that was stuff that wasn't easy to gather previously. But it was quite quick. And for the external sharing, we needed to have that extra layer. So there's a two-stage approval for that. It's the same as the other sites, but also the information management team also have to approve as a secondary approval before it goes through. And I think you can go up to 3 levels of approval if needs be.
Yep.
Depending on how sensitive the data is. So it gave us that, it saved us time, it gave us control. It has saved us probably some money. It's probably not there fully there yet, but it's certainly the capability. And as we're moving on, we're going to start using Teams and Planner are our next self-service elements. So at the moment, they're not something that anybody can just create. That's got to go through the ops team at the moment. So in the future, they'll be able to go through a very similar process. And we've also done the expiry element. So what happens is after 12 months, if after a site has been created, an email goes to the site owner to say, is this site still required? Now, we put that in initially last year when we did the migrations. There is a bit of a rethink there with information management. They would rather that we did that, the 12-month recertification for external sharing sites, but
Yeah.
probably for the team collaboration one, the internal collaboration, they're quite comfortable for them to continue rolling on. However, we will look at the adding a policy that if they haven't, if nobody's accessed that site for a period of time, we then look at contacting the site owner and just saying, look, nobody's accessing this, and that's going to be very key in the Teams space, because Teams is something that we do want. People will use them for a very small little bit of work, a bit of collaboration, but it'll quickly get out of control. You mentioned the groups thing. That organization had 6,000 groups very quickly. That would be the same thing in our organization for Teams. So we need to put that kind of some kind of policy in there to try and restrict that. So it just keeps everything under control, basically.
I think what you just said is a great example of this concept of right sizing, right? So, hey, we're thinking maybe we want to do a lease, a life cycle lease for everything. Hey, wait a minute, maybe that's a little too heavy-handed. So by policy, that's what's cool about having those policies. You can, the renewal is based down to a policy. So maybe I can have a policy for my external sites that says once a year. and a policy for my internal, workspaces that says, let's just base it on an inactivity threshold. So I think that's a great example of right sizing. And what we've done here, marketing team has taken the full wheel of capabilities, and this is a kind of neat ability to just plot out your journey, right? So what are you using today? And potentially where are you going next? So I think, again, the point here is that there are some things that are essential, right? Provisioning is something you think of immediately because it's how you deliver the service, right? And then usually in a phase 2 or phase 3, we see organizations moving on to the recertifications, the renewals, the managed deprovisioning, and sometimes that stuff takes time, right? Because it's part of it is negotiation with your auditors and your information management team and so forth. So, Darren, I want to thank you for all of your openness and description here. We're gonna pause the content and start taking some questions, but I do want to point out to everyone that we've got this all access tour happening. So take a look at the dates in Edinburgh and in London that are coming up. This is a free registration. So we'll have some links to how you can get to these registration pages available to the attendees. So look out for that if you want to hear in more detail about some of this technology and how it works. But let's pause there and let's actually go find some questions. So it looks like I have a question here. I can only see 2 words of it, but let's see. We've got, how did you get control of files in OneDrive, especially files that should be managed or are important for the organization? So it sounds like, Darren, how are you getting a sense of what's going on in OneDrive and what's important for the organization in there?
So that's definitely a work in progress at the moment. We are, at the moment, testing another AvePoint product called Compliance Guardian, which can search across OneDrive. There is a policy. We do tell people that basically your OneDrive is for work that you kind of draft documentation, things like that, personal documentation, that's fine for OneDrive. But once it's kind of a record of published final version, then it should be moving into the appropriate SharePoint site. We know those behaviors aren't quite there. So we're looking at how we can do that with Compliance Guardian, where we can start looking at, is there a risk of certain critical information being stored in OneDrive rather than elsewhere? So it's quite going to be hopefully quite a useful tool for us to monitor what's happening in that space. So yeah, but that's certainly something in the future that we're working on.
Awesome. And then another question here is about, you had mentioned that there were some pretty strict rules in SharePoint on-prem around records management, with the goal of records management. How has that sort of evolved over time? What's the current thinking about records management in Office 365 for sites, groups, teams, OneDrives? What's the current climate within Ofsted around that?
I think it's we want to aspire to that for certain types of information. For example, all the inspection reports are held in a different system. They're not in SharePoint or anything like that. So that's dealt with in a very different way. I think our information management team would like to do something, but it's making sure that we're not as restrictive as we were previously. So there's a couple of sites where they have wanted to go with the check-in process, so that only one person can amend that document at any one time. But the vast majority have moved away and want the files to be open for everybody who has access to that team, to that SharePoint site, to be able to access it whenever they want and amend it appropriately. So we're not really seeing that restrictive requirement, but we're saying that if you want that, then you can have that by all means. But as standard, it is, if you've got access to that site, you can amend the document in a collaborative way, basically. But yeah, the records management, I think it's something we'd like to do, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, and again, that's another strategy where there is some tooling built into Office 365 around retentions and labeling and things. So, one thing is it is possible to do some punting, right? And say, hey, I'm not sure what I'm doing about this stuff right now. Let me just put everything under a 2-year retention. so
Yeah.
that when we do come to a decision, we can start to be a little bit more formal. Obviously, there's for more stringent records management needs, and when we have in the United States, we have our federal government's National Archives has put forward some fairly challenging mandates for federal agencies. So we see a lot more very particular interest in records management, and so I think that's something that you'll hear more about in the event that they just posted in the chat. If you do have formal records management needs that you've identified, how do you actually action them in the software? I do have a question about what the M and the A stand for in this diagram. So let me back up half a second. What this diagram is, and I believe you guys will all have access to the slides here. The M's and the A's. So what we've done is we've mapped out what we often see as key governance approaches. The outer ring, the blue part of this ring, is more about sort of base level governance. The red ring is more about sort of moderate levels of governance, and then the inner ring is strictly governed. And the M's and A's are simply, is this a Microsoft functionality or an AvePoint functionality, right? So if it's an M, it's a Microsoft out-of-box functionality. An M with a $ is you can get it through the native, but it's going to cost you elevated licensing. And the A is obviously it's included in the AvePoint solution. So it just helps you map out the tooling that's available for each of these things. So that's a good question and something we probably should have elaborated on as we wheeled through the wheel. We are over time, but I have a couple of more questions here. It's a question about policies, because you talked a little bit about policies for OneDrive and SharePoint and how each should be used. And the question is, how firmly or how are you thinking about drawing that line and then enforcing it?
So I think we absolutely want to enforce certainly the SharePoint side of things. OneDrive will be something that we as I say, we'll start to tackle. I think we'll start using the Compliance Guardian information to see whether do we have any concerns in that space, and if we do, then will policy help us in that space, which once we've done those tests we'll be able to see. But certainly we are wanting to keep a strict policy on either a 12-month or 2-year or whatever recertification, or looking at if that site hasn't been used for 3 months, we then look at archiving that site, absolutely, or we'll very quickly get in that position, as I said before, where we'll have over half the sites will just not be used anymore. And you end up, it's that funny thing when it's on-prem, you kind of keep a bit more of an eye on the amount of data storage you're using, because you kind of, if you go over and all the backups and everything, it starts to cost you. With it being cloud, you're not keeping your eye on the amount of data that's being stored in the same way, but it would quickly get into a complete sprawl. So I think we do want to stick with those types of policies. Whether I think I can see us probably tweaking them, and it may well be a case of, well, we know that type of site, we want to have that type of policy or wherever. And I quite actually liked the fact that on the tool that you showed us there, John, that you can actually even allow the individual to choose what policy they want on there. Yeah. So have that where that it's only for a project for 6 months or something, that you can put that down there, or it's a particular, might be you want to do a collaboration on a team event or something like that, you need something just for a couple of months or even a couple of weeks, that you can then say, right, okay, put it down to delete after that time, and that definitely we want to continue with that kind of functionality.
Yeah, and good dovetail there. We have another question about we're using the word policies. So when we're using the word policies, are we talking written policies in the organization, or are we talking Office 365 policies? The clarification here is probably we're talking about all of it, right? So it usually starts with a written or a mandated sort of way of working that might come from a regulatory body or an audit team or something, or even an operations team if it's about efficiency and repeatability. But those policies are kind of the starting point. And then what we've done in the solution is create an element called policy that allows you to have these different flavors of things for where you need to have varying levels of control based off of the business purpose. Last question, I think, because it looks like we're slowing down on questions. And this is actually, go ahead and be honest about this one, Darren, because it is something that we see in many of our customers who contemplate this. So let's talk about the buy versus build, right? Obviously, you had ideas about what you wanted to do from a governance perspective. The question was, did you immediately sort of jump in and engage with AvePoint, or did you scope it out first about what it would take to build this with some scripting and some Power Apps and Flow and all that kind of stuff?
Well, it was kind of, I went to a similar event to what you're advertising on the 10th of July and listened to somebody from AvePoint talk through the cloud governance tool, and that was kind of a light bulb moment for me to go, all right, so we can do this with a tool rather than trying to figure something out ourselves. Yeah. So we were actually in the market really for a migration tool, and that was where it kind of added on from there, because we were trying to decide how to migrate the data, and we just had a recommendation about AvePoint, and it kind of just went from there. We don't really have the internal skills really to be able to do something like this within SharePoint, and it just seemed the right thing to do. And as we were already in the market for that migration tool, it was a couple of two together basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it's something that we do see. Obviously, we're not doing any magic, right? We're using the same APIs and backend hooks that are available to anyone. What we do see though is, what business do you want to be in? As you said, if you have a very well-equipped and bandwidth ready team, right, you can do some of these things. It is fairly easy and straightforward to build out a automated provisioning service. What you want to just look at the two things that we see being challenging on that front is, number one, the rapid pace of change, right? So Office 365 is evolving repeatedly, so it's not a one and done thing, right? It's something that you're going to have to commit to, and also think about the full spectrum there. The provisioning where you gather lots of information is great. If you don't have that periodic recertification and renewal process to feed into the ongoing management and cataloging, then things like your change management processes don't really connect. Your end of life processes don't connect because you don't know who really the owner is anymore, and you're back to that square. So I would say think about it from a full spectrum standpoint, and definitely do look into it, because it's in part, right, what we found is that some of our best customers are customers that are transitioning off of homegrown systems because they've felt the pain there. So great question. I think we may be through the list. So again, thanks everyone who attended for sticking with us here and for watching the presentation. Darren, again, can't thank you enough for your participation and your openness in talking about the journey that you guys have been on. No and problem. I'm sure, let's see where we go next in this big journey of yours.
Excellent. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.